I'd like to present Lindsay Kay and James Niven, who are going to be speaking on Malware Wars, DarkSide Strikes Back as BlackMatter. Please welcome James and Lindsay.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our talk today. So, as she said, we're going to talk a little bit about how DarkSide evolved into BlackMatter and later emerged as Alpha. So my name is Lindsay Kay. I'm Senior Director of Operational Outcomes at Recorded Future. So I run the technical arm of our threat intelligence team, and my, technical specialty is malware analysis and reverse engineering.
Hi, I'm James Niven. I'm also at Recorded Future as a principal threat researcher that focuses primarily on Russian-based ransomware. And today we're going to discuss how ransomware groups will rebrand and kind of reconfigure as external pressures such as law enforcement or mishaps within their own environment occur. And we're going to focus on some of the things that cause them to be tracked, such as misspellings or typos within the code or technical flaws. And this specific example, we're going to talk about DarkSide to BlackMatter to Alpha. So the discovery of BlackMatter, there's a few things that led to this, and we were the first to publish anything on BlackMatter itself. And what happened was DarkSide had attacked Colonial Pipeline, causing the U.S. to have a lot of gas shortages and panic at the pump. This caused law enforcement and security researchers to really hamper down and kind of figure out who these guys were. So on the screenshot on the right, we can see that this is the affiliate panel. DarkSide had mentioned that Bitdefender had found a decryption issue with DarkSide's ransomware, and they were able to decrypt things without paying DarkSide. So that issue above, and then Revil had a similar instance with JBS Food Groups. So they attacked them. They eventually got shut down due to the external law enforcement pressure, and this caused BlackMatter and Revil to be offline. So with those two groups offline, they had something that other groups didn't have, a ESXi and Linux locker. And the importance of an ESXi locker is essentially you can bypass all Windows. If you have a hosted virtual network, you can bypass all Windows protections by just targeting the data store. So you go in there, run a script, and lock the entire network at once. So this is an example, or not an example, this is BlackMatter itself, a representative asking for targets of interest. So they go through the countries that they're interested in, primarily countries, first world countries that have access to a lot of funds and cyber insurance. They specifically say don't target medical institutions or government entities, and they'll use DNB or ZoomInfo to kind of vet these things. So the company will have a description, the profit, how much they get annually. And when they find something that's interesting, what you would essentially do is you would contact this person on exploit forum or wherever this is exploit, and you'll say, I have some networks or something, and you'll communicate offline. So you'd send them this, you'd talk to them on Jabber Talks, and then move forward. And this specific user, although they are a BlackMatter representative, they have a very low post count. Post count doesn't typically matter, but what you can see is they have a 4 Bitcoin deposit. So that says we are here to work and we have something legitimate. So they don't specifically say anything about BlackMatter ransomware or ransomware itself, because that Colonial Pipeline attack led to forum admins really cracking down on specifically stating ransomware for fear of shutting down the forum. So once you get access to BlackMatter's affiliate program, this is the first screen that you'll see. This is their affiliate panel, and it says, we do things better than Revil, Lockbit, Conti. Here's why. We've tested our panel for any vulnerabilities. We've tested our locker against all these devices, all these operating systems, and this is why you can trust us. So on the left, you'll see DarkSide's panel, and on the right is BlackMatter's. These are very visually similar in functional and just almost everything. But from this screen alone, you can handle the victim negotiation or adjusting the price of Bitcoin or Monero. But the thing that we're really going to focus on is the top center of each of these pictures. It's where you generate the locker itself. So PowerShell, ESXi, DLL, EXE, you can generate them. And with that, we're going to hand it over to Lindsay for some technical analysis.
Thanks, James. So at the outset, we analyzed 2 different variants of the malware that were released initially. So one targeting Windows and one targeting Linux and ESXi. So the Windows ransomware had several different extensive like anti-RE and anti-analysis capabilities in it. Nothing insurmountable, but definitely somewhat difficult. On the other hand, the Linux and ESXi one was substantially more straightforward. So the configuration file was completely deobfuscated, and it actually included some of the function names. So you can see some examples of what these function names were just kind of in the code on the bottom right. So it gives you a really good idea of what the code is doing and how it works, and then we confirm that that is exactly what it did. On the top, you can see the ransom note that was dropped by the Windows malware. So they actually did implement several different techniques that made their malware more signaturable. So first were some of the cryptographic routines and kind of the implementation and combination thereof to encrypt the files, but we'll talk a little bit more about this later. Then some of the string obfuscation techniques that they used were fairly unique. So you can see on the top right, this fairly simplistic XOR cipher. We'll dive into the key init function later, but not super wildly challenging, but that's generally something that you'll see different ransomware groups have, that are unique to their different malware variants. Then some of the function call obfuscation that was actually interesting and not something I'd really seen before. So if you look at the bottom picture, that is what a normal function call looks like generally when you do reverse engineering if there's no obfuscation. In the middle is what BlackMatter did. So what they did here is they had a magic value, 22065 FED, and they'd XOR that with another value, and then they would jump to that location. So when you're looking at this in the code, it's not very apparent where exactly that call is being made, so much easier to do some dynamic analysis there and sort of like figure that all out and kind of match it all up, rather than just being able to kind of look and be like, yes, this is exactly what is happening here. So on the subject of magic numbers, here I gave you the one that they were using. This also materialized in some of the stack string obfuscation that they did as well. So unlike normal stack strings, it would be XORed with this value. And it appeared in other places throughout the code as well. So we released a report publishing some YAR rules as well as a string decryptor for the Windows ransomware. And after that, some new versions of the Windows ransomware started showing up. So some of them had very simple changes. So that magical XOR key differed per build that we saw, but there were also some more complex ones. So things like new features. So just as kind of a simple example here, the string encryption, that key init function in the first version that we looked at is on the top. So very simple. The one on the bottom, it appeared in version 2.0, so substantially more complex, but it meant that our string decryptor didn't work out of the box anymore. So I guess by the end, we never did see another version of the Linux and ESXi locker. Not entirely sure why, but there you go. And ultimately, we saw that BlackMatter released 6 different versions, numbered between 1.2 and 3.0 of their malware, between July 2021 and September 2021. So some of the feature additions that they made, we'll talk a little bit about now. So one of the benefits for an affiliate who wants to join a ransomware as a service group is you get access to a developer. So they'll do things like add optimizations, make bug fixes, but they'll also add new features to improve the ransomware. So one of the examples is printing the ransom note on local printers. So the reason that they do this is because it makes it way more apparent that something bad has happened, right? So you're not just popping the ransom note up on the victim's computer, but now it's coming out of the printers, so everybody is fully aware. Additionally, adding the ability to encrypt additional file types, in this case, Microsoft Exchange files, allowing the affiliate to identify specific computers that they do not want to encrypt. So you can see on the right a screenshot of what the affiliate panel looks like. So when you want to build the ransomware, this is where you would do any whitelisting of files or extensions, things like that, any processes you want to kill, and any computers not to encrypt. They also evolved the implementation of their cryptographic algorithm for a couple reasons, which we'll talk about, and looking for large files and encrypting them differently. So oftentimes you'll see ransomware groups do this because, as you can imagine, you want to encrypt as much as you can in as little time as you can, and large files take longer. So sometimes you'll see them encrypt like a fixed size at the beginning or at different increments, but this is something that you want to make sure you do as much damage as you can before the defenders start to clean it up. So let's look at a couple of these feature additions. So here are a couple examples of the ransomware note printing functionality. So on the left, you can see the first iteration. So between version 1.6 and 1.9, pretty much gets the default printer, checks if it's PDF printer, and if it's not, then it prints to it. So over time, starting in version 2.0, we see them evolve this function. So Instead of just checking for PDF, you see them look for Sharfax, file, XPS port, and port prompt. So the reason that you're not seeing like a direct string comparison between the name of the printer and those strings is that they have this customized string hashing function that they use to make it a little bit harder to tell exactly what's kind of happening. So you can see they are doing the comparison to those values, and that's how they do it. So looking at some of the capability additions, so on the left you can see part of the function that was used to find and traverse the Microsoft Exchange mailbox path. So now they were able to decrypt these files, and I just want to point out that that magical XOR key has now materialized again here. So you can see how they have some of those stack strings, but it's not kind of the explicit ASCII characters. They're XOR'd with that magic key. So here's another place that it appeared. And on the right, you can see when they're looking for different file extensions to handle as the large files, in this case, MDB, MDF, ADB, and ACCDB. So again, they're doing that string hashing comparison starting in version 1.5. So we talked a little bit about some of the connections between DarkSide and BlackMatter from the human intelligence perspective, but a couple of the researchers identified a more technical connection here. So what they noticed is that after looking through a leaked BlackMatter decryptor, that the same fairly unique encryption routines that DarkSide used, the custom Salsa 20 matrix, was also appearing in BlackMatter. So what this looks like is, here you go on the top, you see DarkSide's random buffer, so the Salsa 20 matrix initialization, followed by RSA 1024 encryption. And on the bottom left, you can see BlackMatter's. So these are fairly similar, but you have the Salsa 20 matrix initialization, followed by the RSA 1024 encryption. And on the right, you can see both of their kind of random matrix implementations. They are different, but conceptually pretty similar. So later on, MZSoft actually released a decryptor for the BlackMatter ransomware that did not require the victim to pay for the key. So they gave it to victims, and then BlackMatter found out about it, and then they actually fixed the issue late September 2021. So can't really speak to the specific issue at hand with the cryptography here, but it's interesting to notice some of the slight changes that materialized in the key initialization code. So you can see some examples on the right, among others that were in the kind of other file encryption code itself.
So this is where the downfall begins, again, for BlackMatter or DarkSide. Interesting thing I didn't denote here was that when BlackMatter came up, they specifically said in their public-facing rules that we don't attack pipelines. So they know that high-profile targets cause a lot of issues for them. With that said, we have DarkSide and BlackMatter facing decryption issues, losing millions of dollars because they are being decrypted in the back end, the victim's just laughing at them. Speaking of a laughing victim, if you read this chat, specifically the last line, you'll notice that someone, either a victim or a researcher or another threat actor themselves, has promptly said that they don't really care too much about what BlackMatter says. And this incident itself was actually very high profile. So the incident response and recovery firms were working on the back. They still had the decryptor before the BlackMatter knew about it, and CISA was involved. It was a large agricultural industry firm. So now we have chat hijacking that comes into play. So immediately after this happened, the chat was basically just spammed with ASCII and all kinds of fun stuff. And BlackMatter themselves couldn't figure out who was the real victim and who was just a troll. So they shut that chat down. They emailed the victim, the actual one, and the same thing happened again. So they did it. They shut that chat down, and they brought it back up with the new requirement of having the victim put in the domain controller name, domain admins, and chat access codes, which we'll talk about later. So this is a screenshot, basically says, okay, we're done again. And it says, we're going to shut down, and their excuse was local law enforcement pressure. And 48 hours after this post, they tore down most of their infrastructure and handed out decryption keys for victims that hadn't paid. So it's not over just yet. So this is an interview by one of our coworkers that interviewed a new group called Alpha. And it's really interesting if you read the interview that Alpha says that we had issues due to the DarkSide or BlackMatter chat hijacking. And this essentially it's not 100%, but it says they have something to do with it. So we're going to piece together a few things that leads the assumption that BlackMatter is alpha. So once you join, or once you're interviewing to join the alpha affiliate program, they'll hand you this set of rules. And you can see every piece that's highlighted. It basically says like their profit models, why they're better than you, why they're better than another group. And the one that's really important to focus on is the bottom right corner. So it's talking about the chat hijacking issue, and it says hello DarkSide, which we know that it's the same groups, but they don't call out BlackMatter. So they're a little too close, and it's kind of just one other thing that makes you raise eyebrows. And this here is, on the left is BlackMatter, on the right's alpha. These are Jabber advertisements sent through Exploit.im's XMPP service. Essentially, you pay a few dollars to have exploits send out to all users online and offline. Just here's our new program. And you see it doesn't specifically say ransomware, but it's kind of indicated with Windows, ESXi, DLLs. They have a Jabber handle to talk to and a Talks ID to talk to. And you'll see the structure of both of them is very, very similar. And with that said, once you get into the alpha program, this is one of the first things you'll see. This is their news panel as well. And this says that their ESXi locker is working awesome. You have specific goals to meet to have higher cuts out of the victim payment. And you'll see other features like these tools and the FAQs that we'll go into next. So BlackMatter had basically been fed up with their dev team. They had failed them twice in 2 different rebrands, and they decided, we're just going to have somebody else develop our ransomware. So they completely rewrote it from ground up in Rust, which, as we heard earlier, is not the most fun thing to look at. They rewrote the panel, a very nice panel, looks nothing similar, it's fast, and all kinds of fun things. And the access code, which we talked about earlier. So in the top, we'll see the access key. This is what they essentially would be on the ransom note. But if you went to VirusTotal and tried to grab this, you wouldn't have the ability to get there without the affiliate putting that code in. So at the bottom corner is where you generate the build in the locker, and it will spit out that access code. So you have to run it in parallel, locker.exe and an access code to generate the correct victim link. So better support, the developers are much more responsive, they have Bitcoin mixtures built in, and one of the more interesting features that we're going to look at is Alpha Morph, which allows us to obfuscate the ransomware itself. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lindsay.
Sweet. So the advertised Alpha Morph is having string obfuscation and some junk code insertion to make it so that the malware, when it's dropped, would evade automated detection by antivirus. So we all kind of know that Linux doesn't really have any super great antivirus, so we're really curious to see what this materialized as in the Linux build. So there was no string obfuscation present from what I could tell, but the 64-bit morph obfuscated samples actually now have what appears to be some sort of like name mangled function names going on versus the unobfuscated ones that had completely scrubbed function names. So you can see examples on the right of what this looked like. So you can pretty clearly see some of the function names and what the functions are doing, which makes version engineering somewhat easier. And in the x86 Linux and ESXi samples, you can just kind of see it with some of the exported variable names. So on the left are the ones from the unobfuscated samples, which you can see no function names that contain the word locker, and the exported variables did also not contain that. So that was interesting. So this was the case at the time that we analyzed these samples, but not entirely sure what they were going for there. So Windows actually had more of these features that we were promised. So you can see some of the string obfuscation. So it was a simple 1-byte XOR randomly generated for each of the strings. You can see on the top the one for starting Discoverer and the function to deobfuscate it. So you can see some of that junk code insertion appearing here. These functions look fairly randomly generated to some degree, with the only kind of like really salient point here being the iterator and the, taking each one and XORing it with 8. So again, yes, there is string obfuscation, not wildly challenging. But one thing that was interesting is I believe they talked about how big some Golang binaries were. The morph obfuscated samples here, the Rust binaries, were actually 4 times the size of the unobfuscated ones. So while the unobfuscated ones ran about 3 megs, the obfuscated ones were about 14, which is substantially bigger. And looking at kind of where a lot of this size increase was, it looked predominantly in the text, data, and relocation sections, possibly due to like most of the superfluous code that was added. So here's an example of what that junk code addition looked like in 2 different morph obfuscated samples. So you can see these 2 builds. This is the same equivalent function from 2 of these samples, but you can see a lot of those random mathematical operations that are kind of inserted on some of the global address space. They really don't do anything or seem to have any sort of like real point to change how the malware works, but the point is to make it harder to detect via AV. So that's what it looked like in these 2 samples.
So as we've heard, the ransomware groups will rebrand and kind of rechange due to either internal conflicts, law enforcement, technical flaws, whatever it is. The cat and mouse game is always going to continue in security. And on the top left, we see a Krebs article where they essentially are trying to dox the developer of Alpha. And there's they're saying it's one person, and they also refer to him as Ben RS on the forums. So Krebs and other security researchers are chasing it down. On the right, we see the FBI release IOCs and give out warnings and indicators of how Alpha will affect other people. And the one that's most interesting is the bottom middle. So this is from the Conti blog, the public blog, and it says that, as we saw with Revil, the Lockbit and Alpha are basically ripping off their affiliates. They're doing this by using a master key to hijack the chats where it looks like the victim no longer shows up, but the victim's now communicating with the administrators of the program and depositing into their Bitcoin wallet, and the affiliate sits there clueless thinking the victim just abandoned them. So not sure if it's true, any of this. It's all just part of the story as we continue and to fight this nasty thing. So with that said, that's our talk, and we really appreciate it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Over there.
Oh, nice talk. So thank you. So with the MCSoft decryptor, it was actually key reuse that resulted in the decryptability. So basically, if you could find a plain text file on the system and then use a known encrypted file, you could use a known plain text attack to recover the original key stream for salsa. So just wanted to let you know.
Thanks. Did you have a question?
No, that's it.
Okay. Any other questions?
Third-party obfuscation techniques like Packers, or yeah, sure. Have you seen any indications of other ransomware products using third-party obfuscation techniques like well-defined Packers or things like that?
Yeah, so basically ransomware groups will basically send out the builds unobfuscated for a large portion. If you're going to generate a build, it's going to be unobfuscated unless there's something that they're doing specifically. So the affiliate or whoever else is using the ransomware has that ability to add whatever they want, any of the Packers, and see all of them, UPX, Themata, just Enigma.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it just varies. It's up to the individual person. There's one back there.
Given your knowledge of the malware, the infrastructure, and some of the actors, could you speculate as to some techniques that might be valuable for de-anonymization, whether it's hacking the infrastructure, or you said there's some communication channels, phishing, stuff like that?
One more time on the one part, did you say what can protect an organization or the ransomware organization itself?
De-anonymizing the actual actors, the threat actors.
Yeah, so a lot of it comes to just their own narcissistic personalities. Most of them are in a protected country that just looks a blind eye to them. So you go on VK or somewhere else and they're usually bragging about it with their fancy cars and all this. And they don't really try to hide it. Like if one of us was doing ransomware in a country that's very heavily against it, we're going to do everything we can do to protect ourselves. It's not the case there. So a lot of the de-anonymization is really helpful, and it doesn't take a lot of technical things. Most of the work in discovering this whole thing was completely just using their person's ego against them, just saying, oh, you're really good, I want to learn more, and then they would just share everything. So human intelligence is a large portion of that, because they get it at every angle with the technical thing, and they're always spinning up C2s or anything like that. So did that kind of answer your question? Sure. What is VK? VK, it's Russian Facebook, more or less. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. So I think I might have missed it, but could you elaborate more on the Linux obfuscation that they applied? It seemed to me like they just applied name mangling and then called it a day, but I don't think I understood.
So the way it works is we don't actually get access to the builder itself, so we just kind of get access to the binary that comes out of the builder, right? So when I looked at it, the one that was unobfuscated didn't have any function names at all. It looked like they had scrubbed them. I don't know how their obfuscation technique worked. Obviously, it's something that's somewhat automated if it changes every hour. But when I looked at it, now it had those naming little function names. So whatever it is between the two of them, at the time we looked at it, did that, if that makes sense.
And to kind of add on to that, so at the point where she looked at it, it was in super alpha phase. And one of the things they said is, what's the point of adding all this obfuscation and stuff to ESXi? Because you can't exactly get Falcon or Sentinel-1 or anything on an ESXi machine. So it's essentially what's going to stop just their ELF binary. There is more to come on that, but we'll tell you about that later. So, any final questions?
Okay, thank you, everyone.